Hello and welcome to Unacademy IAS English, a one-stop destination for the English medium civil services aspirants. A very good morning and welcome to the daily Hindu news analysis. So let's begin today's discussion by first looking at the topics that we are going to discuss. If you look at today's paper, especially the Delhi edition, there are a number of important articles in the newspaper. But if you look at the editorial section, there are few repeated topics. Like we have a column on India-Canada relations related to the rise of Khalistan movement. We have articles related to Aadhaar and STEM research. These are topics which are often repeated and we have covered them again and again. So let's not waste our time by going through the same articles again. Instead, let's look at other important articles in today's newspaper because we have plenty of them. And let's analyze all these topics in complete detail. So we have a total of 10 topics for discussion. So let's get started. But before we begin, please note that on the 10th of November, that is this coming Sunday, we are going to conduct Unacademy Civil Services Championship Test, which is a scholarship test. It gives you an opportunity to attempt UPSC standard question paper at 11 a.m. and 5 p.m. And the best performing students stand a chance to win attractive scholarships for our IAS courses, along with a number of attractive rewards. So please enroll for the scholarship test by using the link provided in the video description. So with this, let's get started by looking at the first article from the front page. On page number 1 and also on page number 12, we have articles related to a very important ruling by the Supreme Court. In fact, yesterday, the Supreme Court has delivered 2 important judgments. And we are going to discuss both the topics. So let's begin with the first judgment delivered by the Supreme Court with regard to right to property. The right to own private property and the powers of the government to acquire private property for public purposes. So let's see what the Supreme Court has said in this regard. See, when it comes to property in India, the Constitution had initially recognized right to property as a fundamental right. I'm sure many students would be aware of this. Our Constitution makers envisioned right to property as a fundamental right, and it was provided explicitly under the provisions of Article 19 and as well as Article 31. Under Article 19, Clause 1, Subclause F, right to property was recognized as a fundamental right. Article 31 contained a related provision. But however, this underwent a change in 1978 through the 44th Constitutional Amendment Act. In order to facilitate land reforms and distribute the land which was largely concentrated in the hands of few landlords and the rich and the elite, the government brought out a constitutional amendment in 1978, and under the 44th Amendment Act, right to property was removed as a fundamental right, so that this would allow the state to acquire private property and distribute it to carry out land reforms in the country. So through this constitutional amendment, right to property was moved under Article 300A. Article 300A was introduced to provide for right to property as just a legal right, not as a fundamental right. Because as long as it remained a fundamental right, it would have been difficult for the government to acquire large tracts of land and ensure the distribution of land to carry out land reforms. So to facilitate the distribution of land, which was a vital resource in an agrarian economy, right to property was nullified as a fundamental right through this constitutional amendment, and it was shifted to Article 300A as a legal right. But over the years, there have been many petitions with regard to right to property. Because when India was a socialist economy, when India followed the socialist model, which believes that the state should own the resources, the state and the public sector should control the economy, the belief was that the state would always work for the common public purpose. In the larger interest of the public, the state is envisioned as the champion of the public purpose. So to facilitate this role of the state in a socialist economy, the government would provide for acquisition of private property. Private property owned by industries, farmers, individuals could be acquired by the state if it would serve a larger community purpose. If the material wealth owned by the private individuals, if it is deemed to serve a larger community purpose, a larger public purpose, the government could acquire that property and later ensure that it is publicly utilized. So let's say the government wants to plan a mega infrastructure project, a huge industrial park, or build a expressway or a railway line. So if the government deems that these are important public purposes to be fulfilled in the larger interest of the community, then even private property belonging to individuals, corporations, etc. could be acquired by the government for the sake of public purpose. So appropriate legal processes would be followed, because right to property was just a legal right, no longer a fundamental right. And as a result, the state would start acquiring private property to fulfill a larger public purpose. So throughout 1970s, 1980s and 1990s, many cases came up at the courts challenging the power of the government to acquire property, that is private property. Throughout 70s to 90s, during those 30 years period, there were multiple cases, multiple judgments. In fact, the current judgment delivered is a continuation of those petitions. Property Owners Association collectively had filed around 16 petitions at the Supreme Court, starting from 1992. And several verdicts were delivered even by a constitution bench of the Supreme Court in the past. So these petitions eventually reached the appeal stage, and now a 9-judge constitution bench has looked at the matter of right to property and the authority of the government to acquire private property. And the Supreme Court has ruled that state has no right to acquire every private property. So let's dive a little deep into this topic and understand the interpretation that has been provided by the 9-judge constitution bench. This constitution bench was headed by Chief Justice of India, D.Y. Chandrachud. And the majority judgment has opined that the power of acquisition of the state when it comes to private property, it's not an all-encompassing right. The state alone cannot go on acquiring private property, and especially in a situation where this could be detrimental to private interests. The Supreme Court has rightly pointed out that the Indian economy has transitioned from a socialist model to a liberalized, globalized model, where private sector also plays a big role. Private ownership of property and resources is as important as public ownership of property and resources. The last 3 decades has clearly shown how important private sector is to the economy. The economic model itself has undergone a paradigm shift, and that is what the Supreme Court has recognized. The Supreme Court has said that state can't simply step in and say that it always has a right to acquire private property and resources to fulfill a larger public purpose. If the state were to acquire private property at every instance, then this will erode private entrepreneurship. It will destroy the private spirit in the economy, which could be detrimental for the health and the well-being of the economy, which is today largely run by the private sector. So this important judgment, it clearly lays down that state can't simply go and acquire private property at every instance. Of course, the state will continue to exercise the right for genuine, valid purposes, but it doesn't mean that every private resource is simply presumed to belong to the state for fulfilling a larger public purpose. So this interpretation is a landmark ruling as far as right to property is concerned. It provides additional protection for private ownership of property, and it restricts and limits the acquisition powers of the state. So while passing this judgment, one interesting point was with regard to the Krishna Iyer doctrine. Krishna Iyer was one of the Supreme Court judges who had laid down a very important doctrine with regard to right to property. In the Ranganath Reddy case of 1977, Justice V.R. Krishna Iyer had provided a dissenting opinion, which was seen as a benchmark with regard to interpretation on right to property. In this landmark ruling of 1977, Justice Krishna Iyer had opined that in a socialist setup, in a socialist economy where the state is the driver of the economy, the state should have a right to acquire private property to fulfill a larger public purpose. This interpretation had been used in subsequent judgments and in various cases of land acquisition to justify the acquiring of private property by the state. But the Chief Justice of India and the Constitution Bench has disagreed with the Krishna Iyer doctrine. The Chief Justice of India has specifically pointed out that the Krishna Iyer doctrine that was laid out in 1977 is outdated, and in the proposed draft judgment, the Chief Justice has even mentioned that the Krishna Iyer doctrine does a disservice to the flexibility and the spirit of the Indian Constitution. So this is a very strong opinion that the Chief Justice had expressed in the draft judgment. See, generally the practice is that when important cases are taken up by the Constitution Bench, before providing for a public judgment, the judges who are part of the Constitution Bench, they circulate their draft opinions. And a draft judgment is prepared, which is a proposed judgment. Some final changes are made, and only then the public judgment is announced. In the draft judgment, the Chief Justice of India was critical of former Judge Krishna Iyer, who laid down the doctrine that the state can acquire property, that is private property, private resources, for fulfilling a larger public purpose. So, Chief Justice D.Y. Chandrachud has been critical of the Krishna Iyer doctrine in the proposed judgment. The final judgment doesn't contain the criticism, but it does refer to the Krishna Iyer doctrine. Now, this in itself has triggered a separate controversy. Can current judges criticize publicly the judgments of previous judges? Because the Chief Justice of India has indeed used harsh terminology. Because the Chief Justice is missing the context in which Krishna Iyer would have laid down the doctrine back in 1977 under the Rangnath Reddy case. In fact, the Krishna Iyer doctrine became so widely accepted that it became the basis for many other judgments. For example, some of you might have heard about the Sanjeev Coke manufacturing case, the Mafatlal Industries judgment, which was all related to private property being acquired by the state, which was eventually challenged at the court, and rulings were passed in 1982, 1997 respectively. In these cases, the judges relied upon the Krishna Iyer doctrine, where Justice Krishna Iyer in the Rangnath Reddy case had opined that the state should have the power to acquire private property. The power to acquire private property in order to fulfill a larger public purpose. Now, this was seen as a socialist goal. It was seen as a socialist principle in a socialist era, where the state could take over private resources and provide for fulfillment of a larger public purpose. So one needs to understand in what context the Krishna Iyer doctrine had been laid down. So for the Chief Justice of India to criticize that now and point out that Justice Krishna Iyer did a disservice to the Indian Constitution would be inappropriate. And this has been pointed out by the other judges as well in the 9-judge Constitution Bench. So if you look at the interpretation of the Supreme Court, which has been provided yesterday, the government has always justified its property acquisition power by quoting Article 39, which is part of Directive Principles of State Policy. I'm sure some of you would be aware of this DPSP, Article 39, Clause B. This directive principle mandates the state to ensure that it can distribute the resources. The state shall, in particular, direct its policy towards securing that the ownership and control of material resources, which includes property as well, of the community are so distributed as best to subserve the common good. This is where the idea of public purpose stems from. If a larger public purpose is being served, with regard to the community, then the state has a mandate under the directive principle to ensure that those resources are fairly, equitably distributed. It's by quoting this directive principle that the state justifies its power to acquire private property, including your private resources. Now, let's look at both sides of the argument. Now, let's say the government says that it can always acquire private resources and private material wealth for fulfilling a larger public purpose. Now, does that mean the government can come and acquire any industry? Even that is a private resource. Can government come and acquire your personal wealth? Apart from land, can government simply come and take over your personal wealth, which can be later interpreted as part of the community resource, which is needed for a larger public purpose? Can the government do that? If the government does that, then it is no longer a free market. It is no longer a market-determined economy. It is a state-controlled economy. Usually, that is a feature of communist, socialist, authoritarian states. So the 9-judge Constitution bench, which passed the judgment yesterday, is absolutely right that the state can't treat every material wealth and resource as part of public good and common good and later acquire those resources. State can't have unlimited powers. In a globalized, liberalized economy driven by the private sector, where private sector plays a crucial role, a critical role as much as the public sector, protecting private wealth and resources, including property, is equally important. So, you can understand why the Supreme Court has passed the judgment restricting the powers of the state. But if you look at the Krishna Iyer doctrine, it is also valid. But in that era, in that context, where India was still a socialist economy. The Krishna Iyer doctrine was brought out in 1977 in the Ranganath Reddy case. The socialist model was serving India well initially. Post-independence, India was struggling for resources. There was no private capital, no private enterprise. The state had to take the lead. The state had to have ownership over resources to provide for growth and development, to distribute land, to create industries and factories. The state was acting as the leader, not the private sector. So in that era, in that context, Krishna Iyer's doctrine was very valid and relevant. It was based on the principles of humanity, humanism, equity, and it was a very fair doctrine that had been laid out. So for Chief Justice of India to currently criticize this doctrine without considering the context in which the doctrine was laid out is inappropriate. So this is not my view. This is the view of other judges, 2 other judges who are part of the Constitution bench. So what do we learn from this article? What do we understand from this historic judgment? Point number one, the Supreme Court has clearly opined that state doesn't have a supreme power when it comes to acquiring private property. All material wealth, private wealth can't be simply treated as part of community wealth just because it could serve a public purpose. So this restricts the right of the state to simply come and acquire any private property and resource. But it doesn't mean states will stop acquiring property. They will. Of course, the state will have a right to fulfill a larger public purpose, but it has been restricted. Coming to the second point, the second important point, which could be useful for writing a mains answer if there is a question on this. Can judges go and criticize previous rulings, judgments, and doctrines? Was it appropriate on the part of Chief Justice of India to condemn Justice Krishna Iyer, stating that he did a disservice to the Indian Constitution? Because it's a very harsh opinion. So this is where 2 judges disagreed with the Chief Justice of India. Even though it was only part of the draft judgment, not part of the final judgment, Justice B.V. Nagaratna and Justice Dalia both have disagreed with the Chief Justice of India. They have said the Chief Justice of India should not have passed these remarks as it is seen as inappropriate because it doesn't consider the context in which the Krishna Iyer doctrine was laid out. And by the way, if you don't know about Krishna Iyer, Justice Krishna Iyer is a legendary figure as far as India's judicial system is concerned. It was Justice Krishna Iyer who introduced major reforms and carried out or rather brought in important judgments which transformed our criminal justice system. For example, it was Krishna Iyer who laid down the norm that bail should be the regular practice, not jail. Jail should be the exception. Bail should be the norm. This important tenet was laid down by Justice Krishna Iyer. Both Justice Nagaratna and Justice Dhulia, they have paid tribute to Krishna Iyer and pointed out that he was a humanist. He always kept human beings at the center of every judicial ruling and judgment. And any ruling passed by Krishna Iyer was focused on equity, fairness. So back then, when India was a poor country struggling to see any growth, the government had to lead from the front. The government had to control resources, including the right to have some control over property. It's in that context that Krishna Iyer had laid down that doctrine over property, which essentially enabled the state to acquire private wealth and private resources and use it for larger community public purpose. But of course, today we have seen a big shift. Today we are no longer in a socialist era. Right? Post 1990s, the LPG reforms, right? We have seen a paradigm shift in our economic model, where it is market driven, where state acts like a catalyst and private sector drives the economy. So in such a model, it's important to protect private capital and private resources, and states can't simply acquire every private wealth and resource. So the ruling is absolutely fine, but the remarks passed by the Chief Justice of India in the proposed draft judgment is what has attracted controversy, as the other judges who are part of the Constitution bench have disagreed with it. And they are of the opinion that it was inappropriate on the part of the Chief Justice of India to criticize Justice Krishna Iyer. So this is what we learn from this important topic. Now, let's look at a question. You can expect a straightforward question on this topic. Maybe a question on right to property in general, how right to property has evolved in India, or UPSC might ask you to examine the recent ruling of the Supreme Court regarding the acquisition of private property by the state for public purposes. So when you're writing an answer, you need to present the historical context. Maybe you can start by talking about right to property, how it has evolved from being a fundamental right to a legal right. Or another good introduction would be talking about the change in the Indian economy from a socialist model to a liberalized, privatized model, pointing out why private wealth, private material resources are important in the LPG era, as private capital, private industry is what drives the growth. You can point out that maybe in the socialist era, state should have had greater control, given that state was driving the growth of the economy. But in a market-driven economy, this concept seems to be incongruent with the idea of liberalization and privatization. So that explanation as well could be a good introduction. Then in the body, you can discuss the evolution of right to property, how the Krishna Iyer doctrine was laid out, which became the basis for several other judgments that enabled the state to acquire private property for public purpose. And then discuss the current ruling of the 9-judge Constitution bench. So this is a culmination of this multi-decadal judicial process. For more than 40 years, this issue has been going on regarding what should be the extent of state powers when it comes to acquiring property. So now there seems to be a final ruling by this 9-judge Constitution bench. So present those arguments, then conclude your answer by pointing out that government, yes, should have the right to acquire private property, but only in exceptional circumstances. Only when the larger public purpose is being fulfilled, but not in each and every instance. Right? If private property is not protected, then it might kill private enterprise. It might kill the market-driven economy. Right? So you need to present that counter view as well and balance out the answer. So now let's look at another important article. Again, a Supreme Court judgment, a very important ruling regarding regulation of minority educational institutions. See, in Uttar Pradesh, back in 2004, a law had been passed, the UP Madrasa Education Board Act. The UP Madrasa Education Board Act. This law was essentially providing for regulation of the madrasas. It would give the government a say over the curriculum, the qualification and appointment of teachers, etc. The idea was to ensure quality of education, to ensure that education quality is maintained even in religious minority institutions. But Allahabad High Court, in one of its recent judgments, had opined that the law which provides for these rights for minority educational institutions is violative of the basic structure of the Constitution. It was seen as violative of the principle of secularism. The Allahabad High Court had interpreted that this particular law that allowed the state to meddle with religious minority educational institutions was violative of the spirit of secularism, because, don't forget, in the Indian Constitution, there is a fundamental right. Which is this fundamental right? It is Article 30 of the Indian Constitution. Article 30 provides a fundamental right to religious and as well as linguistic minorities. Religious and linguistic minorities in the country, they have a fundamental right to establish and administer educational institutions. So this is to protect the minority communities, to help the linguistic minorities to protect their language, which is in minority, to help religious minorities to protect their religious teachings, and thus protect the spirit of secularism, which is also mentioned in the preamble of the Indian Constitution. So Allahabad High Court had struck down this law as violative of the basic structure of the Constitution and violative of the principle of secularism, because it would allow the state to interfere with the administration of educational institutions. So under Article 30, right, where these institutions have a fundamental right to establish, maintain and administer these institutions, it's largely presumed that states have no right, the government has no right to interfere with their administration. So that is what the law is trying to change. Only with regard to setting the curriculum, determining the quality of education which was being provided in these minority institutions, and also determine the qualification and appointment of teachers, etc. But it was not interfering with the right of the community to deliver religious teachings and preachings. So this was the controversy. Eventually, the matter reached the Supreme Court, whether this law is constitutional or not, whether state has the right to interfere in minority institutions. Any law which could allow the government to interfere in minority institutions, is it violative of the basic structure of the Constitution? Does it violate the principle of secularism? These were the questions, the constitutional questions that were raised. Now the Supreme Court has opined. A 3-judge bench of the Supreme Court, again headed by Chief Justice of India D.Y. Chandrachud, has partially upheld the constitutional validity of this law. So let's understand, what is this exact ruling? The Supreme Court has said that the law is valid. It's not violative of the basic structure. It's not against the spirit of secularism. Why? Because government will always have a right to have a say in the quality of education. At the end of the day, be it a madrasa, be it a linguistic minority institution, or any other religious minority institution, the main purpose is to impart education. So, since education is the primary purpose of these institutions, government will always have a right to determine the quality of education. See, the government will not interfere with day-to-day administration and operations of the institution. It will not discourage the minorities from setting up the institutions or running their institutions. The government will simply ensure quality is maintained, to ensure that the right curriculum is maintained, the right quality, the right teachers are hired. Now this, the Supreme Court has recognized as a right of the government. Now if you look at, let's say, madrasas, because this law is specific to the madrasas. In madrasas, there are different levels of education which is provided. Religious education. Apart from the lower primary level education, there is a higher level education provided as well, which is called Kamil and Fazil. Kamil is roughly the equivalent of an undergraduate course, your UG courses. Fazil is roughly the equivalent of your postgraduate PG courses. Now this is an aspect of higher education. But if you know anything about the Indian Constitution, you would know that higher education comes under the jurisdiction of the central government. If you look at entry number 66, if you look at entry number 66 of the Union list under the 7th schedule of the Indian Constitution, higher education is a matter for the Union government. There is a specific law, the UGC Act, the University Grants Commission Act, and the Union government exercises control over higher education, to regulate higher education, to determine the quality of higher education in the country. So religious education in madrasas at the level of undergraduate, postgraduate courses like Kamil and Fazil should ideally be under the jurisdiction of the center. Center will have a role as per entry 66 of 7th schedule under the union list to set the standards and regulate the quality of education. So that is not essentially unconstitutional. So Supreme Court has said that center or the states in that respective case, because education comes under concurrent list, right? If you look at specific entry, which is entry number 25 of the concurrent list under 7th schedule, even state has a control. The state government also has a certain authority over educational institutions, right? Because education as a subject comes under entry number 25, which was moved into concurrent list. So the governments indeed have a right to at least determine the quality of education, the curriculum, recruitment of teachers, etc. That is exactly what the Supreme Court has upheld. The Supreme Court has said any such regulation by the state is not interference. It's not against the constitution. It's not against the basic structure of the constitution. It's not against the principle of secularism. It doesn't interfere in any way with the religious rights of the community. It doesn't interfere with the linguistic rights of a minority linguistic community. Is this clear? So this is a very, very important ruling. Now, why did I say it has partially upheld the ruling? It has partially upheld the ruling because when it comes to higher education, the rights of madrasas has been curtailed. The Supreme Court has said when it comes to Kamil and Fazil, which represents UG PG courses, it is violative of the UGC Act at entry 66, which should be under the union government. So in that regard, the law becomes unconstitutional. This law passed by the UP Assembly, brought out by the UP state government, right? It's in a way taking over the center's jurisdiction. So only that aspect of this law has been declared unconstitutional. Let me repeat this point. The law was passed by the state assembly through the state government. State has no jurisdiction over union list. Higher education under entry 66 comes under the center. It's on the union list of the 7th schedule. So if you look at education in madrasas, there are different levels of education. The lower primary levels, definitely the state government can exercise its right to regulate that education, because if you look at entry 25 of concurrent list, state will have a jurisdiction to regulate educational institutions. But only when it comes to higher education, that is Kamil and Fazil in madrasas, this would become the jurisdiction of the center. So only that aspect of the law has been declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. But Supreme Court has upheld the validity of the law, recognizing that governments have a right. They do have the authority to ensure that minority institutions are regulated only to maintain quality, not to interfere with religious rights or linguistic minority rights. Is this clear to everyone? So this is a very, very important ruling again. So it has essentially set aside the previous judgment of Allahabad High Court, which had declared this law as unconstitutional, as it saw the law to violate the basic structure of the constitution and the principle of secularism. Now this brings us to another important related topic. But before I take up that article, let's take up a question based on this particular topic. The fundamental right of minorities to establish and administer educational institutions is not an absolute right. Evaluate. The question here is referring to Article 30. I told you that Article 30 guarantees a fundamental right to religious and linguistic minorities in the country. They have a fundamental right to establish educational institutions and administer them to provide religious education and protect their language. But however, it's not an absolute right. Of course, there are reasonable restrictions. This is exactly what the Supreme Court has clarified. The Supreme Court, through this ruling, has clearly laid down what are the reasonable restrictions. The state, that is the central government and state governments, according to their jurisdiction, which is assigned under the union and concurrent list, they do have a jurisdiction to regulate minority institutions. This is a reasonable restriction. It's not a violation of the fundamental right. It's not against secularism or it's not against fundamental rights. It's not a violation of the basic structure. There is a reasonable restriction here. The central government under entry 66 and the state government as well under entry 25, they can regulate and lay down standards and quality measures even for minority institutions. And this is not a violation of the fundamental right. So that is what we learned. So if you can present this in the form of an answer and explain all these arguments, that would complete your answer for this question. Now, let's look at the related topic. The question which came up during this case is that, can any ordinary law be challenged on the grounds that it violates the basic structure of the Constitution? This is the important question which was also addressed by the Supreme Court. Can each and every law which is being passed with the Parliament and the state assemblies, can it be simply challenged on the grounds that it violates basic structure of the Constitution? What do you think? Let me know in the comments. Please let me know in the comments. Can any piece of law, any ordinary legislation, can it be challenged in courts, in High Court and Supreme Court, that it violates basic structure of the Constitution? Will it create any problems, or should that be the case? Should the courts look into every ordinary law, check every law if it is violative of the basic structure? Okay, students are divided. Some are saying yes, some are saying no. Let me tell you what the Supreme Court has opined. If you look at the basic structure doctrine, right, I'm sure all of you know it was laid down under the Keswan and the Bharti case. In the landmark Keswan and the Bharti judgment of 1973, the Supreme Court brought out the basic doctrine concept, the basic structure doctrine was introduced. Now, this is not a well-defined doctrine. It's a loosely defined concept. It includes the core tenets of the Indian Constitution, like democracy, federalism, secularism, etc. Right? The essential core features of the Constitution, the very fundamental foundational structure of the Constitution has been identified. So, the courts have always said that if there is any major change to the very structure of the Constitution, right, if the very nature of the Constitution were to be changed through an amendment, then that is something which should be seen as violative of the basic structure. Now, if you start evaluating every piece of law, every ordinary legislation, if it is held up against basic structure, then it could be as good as rewriting the Constitution itself. See, there is a related case called Raj Narayan case. A very popular case, Indira Gandhi versus Raj Narayan. It is believed that it was this case which led to the emergency to be imposed by then Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. In the Raj Narayan case, the Supreme Court for the first time applied the basic structure concept which had been laid out in 1973 under the Keswan and Bharti judgment. You know what the Supreme Court said in the Raj Narayan case? In the Raj Narayan case, the Supreme Court held that there is a difference between a constitutional amendment and an ordinary law. There is a big difference between an ordinary piece of legislation and a constitutional amendment. The concept of basic structure should be used primarily for constitutional amendments, which could potentially change the very nature of the Constitution, very foundation of the Constitution. If you keep testing every ordinary law against the basic structure doctrine, then since the doctrine is not clearly defined, it's a loosely defined structure, then it might become a case where the courts are rewriting the Constitution. If the courts are sitting and interpreting every law, checking every ordinary legislation if it is constitutional or not on the grounds of basic structure, then it would amount to rewriting the Constitution itself, which is not the domain of the Constitution. Right? Which is not the domain of the judiciary of the Supreme Court. So the Chief Justice of India has said that every ordinary law should not be challenged on the grounds that it is violative of basic structure. Basic structure should be used primarily for constitutional amendments. When the Parliament brings out a Constitutional Amendment Act, that is when it should be challenged to check whether these amendments are violative of basic structure, whether it's eroding the basic structure of the Indian Constitution. You need not check every single law, every legislation. That is what the Chief Justice of India has said. The Chief Justice has referred to the Raj Narayan case, where the basic structure was applied for the first time, and then former Chief Justice A. N. Ray had said that applying basic structure doctrine test to check every ordinary statute would amount to rewriting the Constitution itself. So, the basic structure doctrine should not be abused. It should not be misused to check whether every law is constitutional or not. It is meant only for constitutional amendments, which could potentially affect the very nature, the very basic core of the Constitution. So that is the distinction that you need to understand from this important ruling, from this important observation that the Chief Justice has provided. So now, let's look at the next article. The next article is related to Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee. In Jammu and Kashmir, now we have a new elected government, the National Conference-led government, and in the assembly, in the newly constituted Legislative Assembly of the Union Territory of J&K, Chief Minister Omar Abdullah delivered a very important speech. The speech itself is not too relevant for us. Omar Abdullah spoke about Jammu and Kashmir, the situation in the Union Territory, the impact of the changes that were done in 2019, etc. But one aspect of his speech caught my attention. That's why I have picked up this article. Omar Abdullah paid tribute to former Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee for his far-sightedness, for his vision to transform India-Pakistan relations. And the vision of Vajpayee to keep Kashmir at the center of repairing India-Pakistan relations. This is what caught my attention, and that is why I believe this speech by Omar Abdullah is very, very important, very relevant. So let's go beyond the article. The article itself doesn't provide us the required details and information. So as always, we'll go beyond the article. So let me tell you what was the contribution of Prime Minister Vajpayee as far as Kashmir was concerned, as far as India-Pakistan relations were concerned. Prime Minister Vajpayee was a highly regarded statesman, known for his calm demeanor, known for his strong belief that India's interests have to be protected, and also known for his humanism, for his belief in friendship, for his belief in peace. So Prime Minister Vajpayee not only transformed India into a nuclear power by authorizing the 1998 Pokhran nuclear tests, and even stood up to the United States and withstood American pressure and ensured that India carried out the nuclear tests in 98, even at the risk of increasing tensions with Pakistan. But parallelly, Vajpayee showed his far-sighted vision, his statecraft, by reaching out to Pakistan as well. It is this vision of Vajpayee that Omar Abdullah has praised. So Prime Minister Vajpayee dealt with a very difficult period, especially from 1998 to 2001, was a very challenging period for India's foreign policy, especially India-Pakistan relations. In 98, India carried out Operation Shakti, through which we tested our nuclear weapons for the second time. Of course, consecutive governments had contributed to our nuclear program, starting from the Indira Gandhi government or starting right from the Nehru government, right? So post India's first nuclear test, which was Operation Smiling Buddha in 1970s, India had accelerated its nuclear program, but constantly we faced global pressure, especially from the US, which was trying to derail and target our nuclear program. The Non-Proliferation Treaty was designed to specifically exclude India to ensure countries like India could never develop nuclear weapons. So credit goes to all the subsequent governments as well, the successive governments which stood up to global pressure and refused to sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty and accelerated our nuclear weapons program. But finally, it was under Vajpayee that we managed to test the nuclear weapons. By 1990s, finally our nuclear program was at a mature stage. By early 90s, the Narasimha Rao government made attempts to test the nuclear weapons, but American pressure had prevented India from carrying out public nuclear tests. Eventually, it was Prime Minister Vajpayee, right, who could see through this nuclear test, which put India on the nuclear map, giving India a strategic deterrence against hostile neighbors like China. So obviously, when India tested nuclear weapons, immediately it triggered a nuclear arms race. Pakistan followed it up with its own nuclear test within a couple of weeks, which triggered tensions for China and the other nuclear weapon states. It set off a chain reaction amongst the nuclear weapon states to increase their nuclear arsenal, to build up their deterrence, and it increased the tensions between India and Pakistan especially. A nuclear arms race had broken out in South Asia, so it was a period of heightened tensions. Parallelly, Pakistan was involved in sponsoring terrorism and insurgency against India as part of its covert war. Especially in Jammu and Kashmir, Pakistan was actively sponsoring the separatist movement and the militancy in J&K. So India-Pakistan relations were fractured and it was at a low point, especially after the nuclear tests by both India and Pakistan. The relationship had taken a nosedive and tensions were mounting because of the nuclear arms race which had started. So now global powers led by US and European countries, they were pressurizing Prime Minister Vajpayee and as well as the Pakistani leader Nawaz Sharif to reach out to each other and normalize the relationship. The then Pakistani PM Nawaz Sharif was being pushed by Western countries and even Prime Minister Vajpayee was being pushed by Western powers so that India-Pakistan could talk to each other to address the tensions which had built up following the nuclear tests of both countries. So it was in this context that Prime Minister Vajpayee opened a new chapter in India-Pakistan relations. Despite all the hostility, the history of wars and conflict, Prime Minister Vajpayee extended a hand of friendship to Nawaz Sharif and carried out a historic visit to Pakistan to visit Lahore. The Lahore Summit of 1999, which was held in the month of February, was a historic summit. Even till date, it stands out as a landmark event in India-Pakistan relations. This led to the opening of a new chapter. The Aman Ki Asha initiatives were started by the civil society, trying to build peace between India and Pakistan despite the Kashmir issue. And it was thanks to the visit of Prime Minister Vajpayee to Lahore that bus services, connectivity, trade, cultural ties were promoted between India and Pakistan. Direct bus services were launched, Delhi to Islamabad, Lahore to Amritsar. These buses were launched. Train services, cross-border train services were reactivated, the Samjhauta Express, for example. Then cross-LOC trade and connectivity was promoted to bring Jammu and Kashmir closer to POK. Because when Pakistan occupied parts of Jammu and Kashmir, that is parts of India, it essentially separated the Kashmiri families. Kashmiri families have been divided on both sides of Kashmir. So it was the initiative of Prime Minister Vajpayee that facilitated the opening of cross-border or cross-LOC movement. So people from J&K could reunite with their families, which were separated across in the POK. Cross-border trade was promoted, which facilitated the border villages, the border community to build their livelihood, to sustain their livelihood. Cultural ties were promoted. So thanks to the bus and train connectivity and the opening up of economic and cultural relations, it transformed India-Pakistan relations. It was a landmark step. In fact, Prime Minister Vajpayee, during Lahore Summit, made a very important statement. He said, we can choose our friends, but you can't choose your neighbors. You can't change geography. You can't change your neighbors overnight. You have to learn to deal with your neighbors. Pakistan might be problematic. It might have been hostile. But we can't change the reality, the fact that Pakistan will be one of India's immediate neighbors. So we have to learn to deal with Pakistan and try to build a friendly partnership. So this vision, this idea to deal with all neighbors in a friendly manner was driven by Prime Minister Vajpayee that laid a new framework for India-Pakistan relations. In fact, both sides went on to sign key agreements as well. They signed the non-nuclear aggression avoidance agreement to prevent wars between India and Pakistan, now that both were nuclear states, to reduce the tensions with regard to the nuclear weapons possessed by both countries. Few agreements were signed. So this was a new breakthrough in India-Pakistan relations. This laid the stage for discussing all contentious issues, including Kashmir, terrorism, etc. But however, it was very quickly disrupted by the deep state of Pakistan. Since Nawaz Sharif and Vajpayee were getting closer, the two governments were getting closer and building a peaceful relationship, it was immediately disrupted by the Pakistani army. Then Army General Pervez Musharraf would plan the Kargil invasion, leading to the Kargil war. So there's a reason why the Kargil war happened, why Pakistani troops tried to take Kargil. This was a plan of Pervez Musharraf to disrupt the peaceful ties, and eventually it led to a limited conflict between India and Pakistan. So despite this hiccup, and despite the IC-814 hijacking that would follow in that very same year, in December 1999, which was again sponsored by the deep state, by the Pakistani intelligence agencies. Despite that, India made one more attempt in 2001 to try to normalize the relations between India and Pakistan. Prime Minister Vajpayee reached out to Pervez Musharraf to hold the Agra summit. Because after the Kargil conflict, Pervez Musharraf staged a military coup. As always with Pakistan, the civilian leadership was thrown out by the military dictators, and Pervez Musharraf toppled the Nawaz Sharif government and captured power, became a military dictator and eventually the president of Pakistan. Even with Pervez Musharraf, Vajpayee reached out with a hand of friendship, and we held the Agra summit. Because by then tensions had increased between India and Pakistan after the Kargil war, after IC-814 hijacking, and after the developments in Afghanistan as well. Right? India and Pakistan were looking to stabilize the relationship, and Agra summit was crucial. And this again was an initiative driven by Prime Minister Vajpayee. The United States especially was putting pressure on India-Pakistan to normalize the ties. And Vajpayee used the opportunity to reach out to Pakistan, and Pervez Musharraf visited India, met Vajpayee at Agra, but unfortunately Agra summit was largely a failure. Because Pakistan was hard-lined in its position. Prime Minister Vajpayee said, blood and talks cannot go hand in hand. You can't be flowing the blood of Indians through terror attacks, and we can't be talking and discussing to you about issues like Kashmir and trade. India made it very clear that talks and terror cannot go hand in hand. So this position of India that we have to discuss terrorism first, only then Kashmir and other issues, was not accepted by the Pakistani side. Pakistan insisted that Kashmir should be discussed first, and terrorism and other issues will come later. So this position of India-Pakistan led to the failure of Agra summit. But this whole period, you can see how Vajpayee was driving India-Pakistan relations on the peaceful path. Despite the repeated provocations, the repeated backstabbing by Pakistan through repeated attacks and escalations, India still insisted on the path of peace and talks and resolution. And that credit goes to Prime Minister Vajpayee. So Omar Abdullah has paid tribute to this vision of Vajpayee, because if Vajpayee had succeeded, if Pakistan had not betrayed, as it always has done, then there would have been an opening for India-Pakistan to normalize the relations. And who knows, maybe even to find solutions to the Kashmir problem, bring development, bring stability to Kashmir as well, and end the violence and insurgency. So this is what was possible. But as always, the deep state of Pakistan, the hidden part of the Pakistani government, the army and ISI, ensured that they would not allow this to happen. By repeatedly targeting India through covert wars, through sponsored terrorism, they broke the relationship, and as you know, the rest is history. So now, let's look at another important article on page 16. On page number 16, we have an article related to India's approach towards Myanmar. As we have studied in previous sessions, Myanmar is going through a brutal civil war. Ever since the military junta captured power again in 2021 by nullifying the 2020 election results, Myanmar has descended into a state of civil war where several stakeholders are opposed to the military regime. All the pro-democracy forces, the political groups, have united in the country, including the National League for Democracy, the main political party of Myanmar, headed by Aung San Suu Kyi. So all pro-democracy forces, political groups and parties, along with civil society organizations which support democracy in the country, they have all united to form a national unity government to oppose the military regime and to target the military regime. Parallelly, you have the ethnic armed organizations, the various ethnic armed groups of the Shan community, the Rohingya community, the Chin community and the others, the Kachin community. These various indigenous ethnic groups of Myanmar, which have been fighting insurgency for decades, even they have opposed the military regime, and they have also taken up this war against the military regime. So these forces have largely united. The pro-democracy forces, political groups and civil society organizations, and the ethnic armed groups. So collectively, they have launched a major attack on the military regime to remove the military junta from power, and they have seen some success in this ongoing civil war. The pro-democracy forces and ethnic armed groups, they have been able to capture significant territory. They have delivered a significant setback to the military regime. And today, Myanmar's military, the Tatmadaw, has lost control over key areas, critical border points and large areas of territory. So this has always been a matter of concern for India. What will happen if the military junta is thrown out of power? What will happen if the rebel groups capture the country and if it is divided between different armed groups and other political groups? How will India handle that situation? Because don't forget, India shares a very long border with Myanmar, which is around 1,643 kilometers. The security situation in northeast India is directly dependent on the stability of Myanmar. Because across this border, there are many threats for India, from rampant organized crime, which is seen in the Golden Triangle region in Myanmar, Thailand, Laos, and Cambodia. The crime present here, organized crime like drug trafficking, arms trafficking, cyber crimes, etc., it spills over into northeast India, bringing drugs and weapons, making it easily available for the insurgents. Northeast insurgents have relied on support from inside Myanmar. Northeast insurgents have easily crossed over into Myanmar and found a safe haven. This has been a major concern, a major threat for India. That is why all these decades, India had a friendly relationship with the military junta. Ever since military junta came to power in 1962, and even recently when it came back to power in 2021, in both the instances, India has had very good equations with the military regime. We've always dealt with the military regime, given recognition to it. We even ignored Western sanctions on the military regime. When military regime was violating democratic rights and human rights, Western governments led by US and Europe had imposed sanctions on Myanmar's military regime, but India ignored the sanctions and we stood with the military regime. We even have very good security ties with them. We supplied arms and weapons. We have joint military exercises, right? We even conduct joint operations to target insurgents. So India has always enjoyed fantastic ties with the military regime. But now things are changing on the ground. There is a possibility where the pro-democracy forces or ethnic armed groups might take control by toppling the military regime. So India is trying to prepare for this. India is trying to prepare for this eventual possibility. So India has held a conference for the first time ever by inviting all the stakeholders in Myanmar. You might think it's a very small issue. No, it's not. It's a very, very big development. For decades, for almost 6 to 7 decades, India has always worked only with the military regime, with some political groups like NLD. But for the first time, India is showing the willingness to reach out beyond the military regime, reach out to the political groups and the ethnic armed groups as well, and civil society organizations. So the Indian Council of World Affairs, which plays a role in India's foreign policy, has organized a conference by inviting all the stakeholders. So representatives of the military junta were invited to Delhi. Representatives of the political groups and the civil society have been invited. The representatives of the National Unity Government have been brought to India. The Indian ambassador in Myanmar met with all these representatives and stakeholders and sent them off to Delhi to attend this conference organized by India. This is a clear signal that India is preparing for what might happen in Myanmar. If tomorrow there is a power sharing arrangement between the military and the political groups and armed groups, or if, let's say, military regime is completely toppled and thrown out, India is preparing for such an eventuality by trying to build ties and contacts with all the stakeholders. It's in this context that the conference organized by Indian Council of World Affairs, by inviting all the representatives, is a very, very big development. It clearly shows India's approach that we are going to take as far as our ties with Myanmar is concerned. We are looking to protect our interests, cut our losses. We can't permanently depend on the military regime. Tomorrow, if the opposition rebel forces come into power, right, they may not cooperate with India. They might even turn against India, given that India was always backing and supporting the military regime. So we are trying to correct and balance the equations, the political equations in Myanmar. And this is a very important outreach by India. Now, can you read about the Indian Council of World Affairs? Can you find out some important points about this institution and please mention that in the comments below. So this is a small homework, a small assignment for you. Next, another development on page 16. There has been another terror attack, most likely a terror attack in Pakistan, in the coastal city of Karachi, targeting Chinese workers. Now, this is not a new development. Over the last few years, China has become increasingly concerned about the targeted attacks which are happening against its workers and nationals, including its diplomats in Pakistan. Repeatedly, Chinese consulate has been attacked in Karachi. Chinese diplomats have been targeted. And more importantly, Chinese projects and Chinese workers have been targeted. For example, there was one major attack a few months ago where several Chinese workers were killed. Recently, there was another bomb blast in Karachi where several Chinese workers were killed. So this marks a growing concern for China. Because see, China is setting up the CPEC corridor, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, as part of its Belt and Road Initiative. Under the ambitious Belt and Road program, the One Belt, One Road project, China is setting up the CPEC corridor that connects China's Xinjiang province from the city of Kashgar to the port cities of Pakistan, Karachi and Gwadar. China has built the strategic Gwadar port in Balochistan province. It has played a role in the development of Karachi port as well. And it is building a massive corridor via Pakistan. It includes road and rail projects, power projects, industrial projects, etc. Now, obviously, India has boycotted the CPEC and Belt and Road Initiative because it passes through POK. You can clearly see in the map, the alignment of this corridor is contentious for India. It violates India's sovereignty because it passes through Shaksgam Valley, which Pakistan has gifted to China. And it passes through the rest of POK, Pakistan occupied Kashmir, which is essentially Indian territory, illegally occupied by Pakistan. So naturally, India has boycotted the project. We have boycotted the Belt and Road Initiative itself. But for China, CPEC is a priority because this gives China direct access to the strategic Arabian Sea and the Persian Gulf. Even China is heavily dependent on oil and gas from the West Asian countries. So most of these energy supplies to China comes from this route. It passes from Persian Gulf through Hormuz Strait, then Gulf of Oman, and from here directly China can take the energy supplies through Gwadar and Karachi and bring it directly into mainland China. This will allow China to reduce its dependency on Malacca Strait. Because Malacca Strait near Singapore is a choke point, which is a weakness for China. China fears that US or India might impose a naval blockade at Malacca, thus crippling the energy imports of China. So China is trying to create alternate routes to reduce its dependency on Malacca. And one of the project is CPEC project. Because through this, China can directly connect with Indian Ocean without depending on Malacca Strait. Without having to pass through Malacca, China can directly access oil and gas from West Asian countries via the Hormuz Strait. So Gwadar and Karachi ports are critical. So CPEC is a high profile project, high priority project for China, but repeatedly, many of these projects have been targeted. So which are the terror groups targeting these projects? Which are the terror groups targeting China? One would be the TTP or Pakistan Taliban, Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, which is the Pakistan branch of the Taliban. The TTP has been in a state of war against the Pakistani state. It has openly declared its opposition to Chinese involvement and the CPEC project. And there are several Baloch groups, Baloch insurgent groups, which are fighting for Baloch liberation. So in Balochistan, there is an active insurgency going on from several decades, right from 1947. So Baloch insurgent groups have also been involved in targeting Chinese workers and Chinese projects. And this is where Pakistan accuses India of being involved in these attacks. For several years, Pakistan has been accusing India's intelligence agency for sponsoring Baloch groups and even the Pakistan Taliban. But India denies these accusations. Pakistan has never been able to present any evidence to link these attacks or these terror groups with Indian intelligence agencies. India has always denied the involvement, but Pakistan keeps blaming it on India. Now, China, which is always supporting Pakistan when it comes to other terror groups like Lashkar-e-Toiba, Jaish-e-Mohammed, etc., which target India, China has never helped India. China has even shielded Pakistan at platforms like United Nations. When India tried to list Masood Azhar, Hafiz Saeed, and such terrorists under the UN Sanctions Committee, China blocked those proposals and protected Pakistan. Right? China has even indirectly encouraged Pakistan and its covert war against India to keep India destabilized. But now China realizes that the terrorism which has been bred and cultivated in Pakistan could affect Chinese interests as well. Right? So this has led China to put pressure on Pakistan. China has strictly ordered Pakistan to ensure the security of its workers, its nationals, its projects, and more importantly, its consulates and diplomats. So this represents a friction as well between China and Pakistan. And that is what you need to know with regard to this development. Now, coming to the last part of today's discussion, let's quickly go through the few prelims articles which are there in today's newspaper. On the front page, we have an article related to Wikipedia and the standoff with the government of India. See, recently a major controversy has broken out over the content which is published on Wikipedia platform. I'm sure you would have heard about a news agency called ANI, right? ANI is quite a popular news agency in India, right? It also runs a popular YouTube channel with podcasts. And there was a Wikipedia page on ANI, which contained few controversial statements about ANI. This Wikimedia page, it accused ANI of being pro-government, of promoting the propaganda of the Modi government, of being favorable for right-wing ideology and for deliberately taking an anti-Pakistan position and to favor the position of the Indian government. The allegation basically was on this page that ANI is working at the behest of the Indian government, most likely at the behest of Indian intelligence agencies. So this was labeled by Wikipedia on a particular page, right? ANI was basically labeled as a propaganda arm of the Indian government. So ANI took offense to this because this raised questions over the credibility of the media outlet. So ANI went to court challenging this particular content on Wikipedia and seeking compensation from Wikipedia for the damages caused. So while this case is going on between Wikipedia and ANI, the government of India has stepped in on the side. Ministry of Information Broadcasting has issued a notice to Wikipedia as to why shouldn't the government consider Wikipedia as a publisher and not as a intermediary. See, right now, government views Wikipedia, which is another online platform, as a intermediary. Basically, a third-party platform which is hosting the content posted by users. I'm sure all of you know Wikipedia is largely an open source platform, right? Where users from around the world will contribute the content, right? Anybody can volunteer to sign up to edit the content. And of course, Wikipedia has its own editorial team, which tries to edit the content as well. But Wikipedia is not for profit. It's a non-profit organization run entirely through donations and contributions. So it would be incorrect to compare Wikipedia with other big tech companies or social media firms, but eventually it is seen as an intermediary, as a platform which is a source of information. Most of us even consider Wikipedia as a digital encyclopedia, right? For everything in the world, there is answers on Wikipedia because there are pages maintained on Wikipedia where users from around the world are constantly updating the content, correcting the content. Wikimedia puts a lot of effort as well to ensure the content is as correct as possible. But as you know, not all content on Wikipedia is authentic or genuine. There could be errors, there could be factual mistakes, or there could be biases as well, right? So this has always led to controversy about the kind of content, the authenticity of the content on Wikipedia platform. Now, if Wikipedia is seen as only an intermediary, then it will enjoy the protection of safe harbor provision under IT Act. Remember, we have studied safe harbor repeatedly. Under IT Act, intermediaries, including social media platforms, online digital platforms, they're all considered as intermediaries who are hosting the content posted by someone else. They get a safe harbor, which is a legal immunity. So even if there are criminal charges tomorrow, the company will not be targeted. The company will not be liable for criminal charges and criminal prosecution. Only if the company doesn't follow the new IT rules, to take down objectionable, unlawful content and cooperate with the authorities, only if it doesn't show due diligence, only then the government can revoke safe harbor provision under Section 79 of IT Act. So as of now, Wikipedia is slightly protected. It does get the safe harbor provision under IT Act as long as it shows due diligence with the government, as long as it follows the new IT rules of 2021. Until then, it is seen as an intermediary enjoying legal immunity, and the platform itself can't be held liable for the inaccurate content on its platform. But now the government is asking, it has issued a notice. Instead of treating you as an intermediary, why shouldn't we treat you as a publisher? Because eventually, Wikipedia content is being consumed by a large audience. If there are inaccuracies, biases, factual inaccuracies, and if the platform is not attempting to correct them, right, then why shouldn't we treat the platform as a publisher, which will make it liable for legal prosecution, criminal prosecution? Let's say ANI were to press defamation charges, criminal defamation. Then the point is, why shouldn't we arrest the officials of Wikipedia in the country, and why shouldn't we press those charges and continue with those charges under prosecution? So this has been raised by the government. Now, this is again a controversial topic, a debatable topic. On one hand, the government does have a valid point, because Wikipedia is never an authentic source of information. That's why I always tell my students, don't rely entirely on Wikipedia, right? The information may not be entirely correct, may not be authentic, because eventually users are editing the content. Wikipedia is in no position to check the validity, the accuracy of each and every content. But of course, look at the other argument as well. Wikipedia has truly democratized information. It has played a pivotal role in the world, right? It didn't become a digital encyclopedia overnight. It's a not-for-profit organization, by the way. It has done a tremendous work through which millions and millions of people around the world are getting basic access to information. On each and every topic, everything under the sun from A to Z, you will find content on Wikipedia. Most of the content is pretty good. There are certain pages which does provide a decent content, but it may not be entirely accurate, entirely authentic. So government does have a valid point. What if someone is misusing the platform? What if there are users, third-party users, deliberately misusing Wikipedia pages to defame someone, to target the government, right? Or to criticize someone in an unfair manner by using their bias, right? So in order to ensure full accountability under the law of the land, the government has raised this valid question. Why shouldn't we treat Wikipedia as a publisher, right? Instead of treating it as an intermediary, which enjoys legal immunity and safe harbor right now, why shouldn't we treat Wikipedia as a publisher? That is the question raised by the Information Broadcasting Ministry. But look at the counter argument. Now, is this government interference? Is the government misusing its authority and targeting any platform which is critical of the government? Is the case related? Is the ANI case and the notice given by I&B Ministry, is it related? That's the question which comes up, right? But either ways, you should know the difference between the treatment of publisher and intermediary under the IT laws. As per the IT Act and the new IT rules of 2021, intermediaries have an obligation. Only if they fulfill those obligations, they will enjoy the safe harbor and legal immunity. If Wikipedia were to be treated as a publisher, then it will be open for criminal prosecution under the law. Next, on page 4, there is a very important article. It's important for mains as well, not just for prelims. The UP state government has introduced a new set of laws with regard to appointment of DGP of the state police, the Director General of State Police. The DGP is the highest ranking position. The DGP is the head of the state police. Now, when it comes to appointment of DGP, there are certain rules that were laid down by the Supreme Court. If you look at the 2006 Prakash Singh case, it was a historic judgment in the context of police reforms. See, one issue which has plagued Indian police is the excessive political interference with regard to appointment, promotions and transfers. The excessive politicization of police has made the police force very ineffective, corrupt as well. So, with regard to the push for police reform, the Supreme Court had passed a historic ruling in 2006 in the Prakash Singh case. By the way, Prakash Singh himself was a former DGP of UP police, IPS officer. So, in this landmark judgment, Supreme Court laid down a 7-step directive. It issued 7 directives to be followed by state governments and the center while managing the police force. One of the directive was related to the appointment of the DGP. What was the process laid down by the Supreme Court? The Supreme Court said, when DGP is being appointed, there should be a fair process. Given the important role of the DGP, who heads the state police, there should be a degree of autonomy, a degree of independence, which should be given to the DGP to run the police force professionally without political interference. To reduce the politicization, the independence of the office has to be protected, the tenure of the office had to be protected. That's why the Supreme Court said that there should be a process. The state government simply, it can't decide who will be the DGP on its own. Instead, the state government, headed by the Chief Minister, accompanied with the Home Minister, they will come out with a list of 3 senior eligible IPS officers. The state government, including the Chief Secretary, Home Secretary, the Home Department, after consulting the CM and the Home Minister, will come out with a list of 3 senior most IPS officers who are eligible. Now, this list will be forwarded to UPSC. It brought a role for UPSC. The Supreme Court said UPSC will get a role. There will be a committee. The current process is that UPSC chairperson heads this committee along with the Union Home Secretary, the Secretary to the Ministry of Home Affairs will also be a member of this committee. The Chief Secretary of the state, who is the highest ranked civil servant at the state level, and one of the heads of a CAPF, Central Armed Police Force, like BSF, CRPF, CISF, etc. One of the heads of a CAPF who's not from the same cadre. Now, let's say UP DGP has to be appointed. Then, one of the heads of a CAPF who's not from the UP cadre, a senior IPS officer who's heading a CAPF, who's not from UP cadre, will be part of this committee, headed by the UPSC chairperson, accompanied by the Union Home Secretary and Chief Secretary of the state as members. So they will finalize one name to be appointed as the DGP of the state police, thus bringing more balance and more transparency into the appointment process and protecting the independence of the office and thus minimizing political interference in the police system. Along with this, the Supreme Court mandated a security of tenure for the DGP. Minimum 2 years of tenure. Before 2 years, the governments were ordered not to transfer the DGPs, not to remove the DGPs. So this was designed to protect the independence of the office of DGP. But however, this was only until states could bring out their own laws. So few states like Punjab, then UP, started bringing out their own laws to change the appointment process of the DGP. Recently, the AAP government in Punjab triggered a controversy by introducing a law that took out the role for UPSC in the appointment of DGP. That goes against the verdict, the Prakash Singh judgment. Essentially, the Punjab government gave itself the authority to appoint the DGP by creating its own process, which is, by the way, allowed under the Prakash Singh judgment. But it has eliminated the role entirely for UPSC, and the state itself has given itself a role. Now, UP has done the same. The UP government also has brought in a law that takes out the role for UPSC and allows the state government to decide on the DGP appointment. Now, related to this, in 2019, there was another ruling by the Supreme Court where security of tenure was brought down to 6 months. From the earlier 2 years tenure, which was guaranteed under Prakash Singh judgment, in 2019, Supreme Court had brought down the security of tenure to 6 months. But still, UPSC was playing a role in the appointment. There would be a UPSC-led committee which would look at the 3 senior names suggested by the state government. And the UPSC chairperson, by looking at the track record with the Union Home Secretary and Chief Secretary of the state and one head of CAPF, would decide as to who would become the DGP. Now, this process has been bypassed by state governments like Punjab and UP. Now, the question is this a violation of Prakash Singh judgment? Is this a violation of the 2019 judgment as well? State governments are saying, no, it's not a violation. According to the government of Punjab and UP, in Prakash Singh case, there was an exception. Exception was, if states have their own laws for appointment, then this process of Prakash Singh judgment need not be followed. But however, other experts and former police officers and DGPs, they are of the opinion that these laws passed by state governments bypasses the UPSC entirely taking away the transparency, thereby giving the state government full control on the appointment of the DGP, which basically leads to politicization of the police force. So this defeats the very purpose, the core purpose of the Prakash Singh judgment, which was a landmark step in police reforms. So the opinion is still divided. Eventually, I think the matter will reach the courts. The court will decide whether these laws are valid and whether the state governments are violating these judgments of the Supreme Court. So coming to the next article, India has hosted the first ever Asian Buddhist Summit. This is another big development with regard to culture and international relations. As you know, India is the birthplace of Buddhism. The Indian civilization is the cradle of Buddhism. Even today, we have multiple sacred pilgrimage sites in India, from Bodh Gaya to Sarnath to many other important pilgrimage places from across UP, Bihar to Madhya Pradesh and Odisha. We have several Buddhist sites. The Indian civilization is seen as the very birthplace and cradle of Buddhism. And today, Buddhism is spread far and wide across Asia, across multiple Asian countries, especially in South Asian countries like Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bhutan, Myanmar in Southeast Asia, and across Southeast and East Asia, from China to Japan to South Korea, to even Vietnam, Thailand, and Singapore, right? Across this part of Asia, Buddhism is one of the most popular religions. So as part of India's diplomacy, soft power diplomacy, we leverage our Buddhist heritage. We promote our Buddhist culture and Buddhist heritage. We even have an initiative called Buddhist Circuit Initiative under Indian foreign policy. Under this, we are promoting tourism from all these Asian countries to India. We are promoting religious pilgrimage by improving the infrastructure at Buddhist pilgrimage sites. By providing for better facilities and infrastructure for tourists at all the pilgrimage sites, we are trying to attract tourists from all these Asian countries to create a cultural link, a soft power link. And in our ties with all these Asian countries, be it with Sri Lanka or Myanmar or Japan or China, with all these relations, Buddhism is a central piece of the relationship. So India, which sees itself as the birthplace of Buddhism, wants to further leverage the cultural heritage, and we have organized the first ever Asian Buddhist Summit. It's been organized by the Ministry of Culture. The Ministry of Culture, along with the International Buddhist Confederation, the IBA, they have jointly organized the first ever Asian Buddhist Summit. So this cements India's position as far as Buddhism is concerned, right? It could serve our diplomacy as well with all these countries where Buddhism is a major religion. In some countries, it's a majority religion, right? And the President of India, Draupadi Murmu, inaugurated the event, spoke about Buddhist principles, values, and heritage, which is an integral part of Indian civilization. So please focus on the Asian Buddhist Summit. This could be relevant for prelims. Who organized it? What is the purpose? So this clearly establishes India's lead role in promoting Buddhist principles and values and leveraging it as part of our diplomacy. Coming to the last article on the sports section, we have an important update. See, generally UPSC doesn't focus on sports, but in recent years, UPSC has surprised us repeatedly by asking such factual questions on sports. But this particular topic goes beyond just a sporting event. India has officially submitted its letter of intent to the International Olympics Committee to host the 2036 Olympics. Now, this is a dream championed by Prime Minister Modi. So, India is preparing to bid for 2036 Olympics. India will be competing against others like Chile, Indonesia, Turkey, and even Saudi Arabia and Qatar are expected to bid. So India will be competing against these countries. So this is going to be a big step for India, because hosting Olympics is a great opportunity and a challenge as well. And it's equally controversial. There are critics who point out whether it's worth spending so much resources on a one-time sporting event. There are others who point out that this will bring a lot of development, more tourism, and it would invigorate the sporting industry in the country. So the opinion is divided on this. So India is very eager either ways to go ahead and bid for the Olympic Games, and India is proposing the inclusion of indigenous games as well, from chess to yoga to Kho. All these indigenous games of India, including Kabaddi. Right? If the Indian bid is selected, if India wins the bid to host the 2036 Olympics, we might see the introduction of the indigenous native games of India as well into the Olympics. So let's pay attention to this topic in the coming days. There will be articles regarding the viability of India hosting the Olympics, why it's a great opportunity, why it is a waste of resources, right? Looking at both sides of the argument, we will have a lot of articles coming up in the next few days. So we will discuss this again. But for now, this is the update that you need to know. Now, please take up one last assignment, one last homework. Read about the International Olympics Committee. Basic facts, maybe 4 or 5 important facts. So essentially, I've given you 2 assignments. One, to read about the Indian Council of World Affairs and the International Olympic Committee. So kindly read about this and post the points in the comment section below. And do ensure you join our official Telegram channel, because after the session ends, we provide a quiz on these topics. It gives you an opportunity to attempt practice MCQs and also to revise these articles that we have discussed and analyzed thoroughly in our Hindu analysis. So the link for the same is provided in the description box. You can join the Telegram channel of Unacademy IAS English and attempt the daily quiz based on the articles in the Hindu. So this brings my discussion to an end. I hope you guys have understood all the topics. And if you benefited from the session, please press the like button. That is what motivates us to do better. And don't forget to comment as well and do subscribe to our channel. That is it. Thanks for watching. We'll see you tomorrow.